Good evening, and welcome to the 2022 Carl G. Weiler Great Decisions Program, which is a major program series of the Indiana Council on World Affairs. My name is Dr. Betty Tonsing, and I am joined this evening by the Great Decisions Committee. Claire, if you would raise your hand and say hello. I'll be introducing this evening's program and the speaker, Dr. Michael Snodgrass. Dr. Ray Montano, Dr. Ray, if you could say hello. Ray will be moderating our robust Q&A, and with you as our guests and in our audience this evening. And we are going to ask if you would please just send your questions to Ray, and you've got two options. You can either send the question and Ray will read your question, or you can say, Ray, I have a question, and we really welcome you asking it. We've always prided ourselves in a robust Q&A, and part of that robust is your asking the question and having that engagement. I think the speaker likes that as well. It really helps keep things really just flowing very, very nicely. And Diane Farrell, if you will please say hi.
Hi.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion group on foreign affairs and how this all intersects with the United States and, of course, with Indiana. The Indiana Council of World Affairs was formed over 100 years ago. I'm sorry, the World Affairs Council of America was formed over 100 years ago, just following World War I, which helped the U.S. move away from being an isolationist nation to the much larger stage that they were now on. And they worked in partnership with the Foreign Policy Association. And the Indiana Council on World Affairs was formed about 70 years ago. And ever since has had as its mission to offer the most informed and credible programs above the loud clatter of propaganda about global matters. And we pride ourselves on doing that still. We are a volunteer board of directors, and we're also a working board. For those of you who have served on boards, you probably know what that working part means, as we currently have no staff. So everything that you see that's about the Indiana Council of World Affairs is by a wonderful board. Our vision for the future is exciting. We are the same name and the same mission, but we are working strategically with a greater vision of connection and engagement, and we're very excited, but still always offering programs that are timely and urgent on the global world stage. COVID in the last couple of years sort of took us all by surprise. I think we'd still like to think we're Zoom experts, but we're still saying, you're muted, you're muted. And the person's scrambling around trying to find that button. But what Zooming has meant for us, it's meant that it's enlarged our audience, because we sometimes have people all around the country, all around the world, and that means we can also have our students come from various places. It's been very exciting. And our Zoom programs have been free. When we had live programs, there was just a nominal fee. But what we have heard from many of you is we love this Zoom option. We hope it doesn't go away. We are also very keen to get back to seeing you live and in person. So we're going to try to figure out how we can do it hybrid. And I think you probably have already participated in some of those, which is very exciting. Now, because we are a volunteer board and we have no staff, all of this is not free. We do have operational costs. So I want you to please consider membership, and also please consider donation. We need you as our friends. We need you as our supporters. We need both. What we need is you. Please be engaged with us, and then we can continue to grow and bring you the quality programs that you have come to expect of us. And for now, I'm going to introduce Claire, who's going to introduce our good friend, Dr. Michael Snodgrass.
Hi. Dr. Michael Snodgrass is the Director of Global and International Studies Program at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, and an Associate Professor of Latin American History. His research is 20th century Mexico, with a focus on migration and U.S. Mexican relations. He has published several books, most recently Dreams of Development in Mexico and Spain, A Comparative History of Guest Workers and Migration Diplomacy, and The Land of Great Tools, How Two Generations of Labor Migrants Transformed Mexico's Immigrant Heartland. Among several awards he has received are a Fulbright-Hays Faculty Research Grant from the U.S. Department of Education and a Fulbright Garcia-Robles Dissertation Research Fellowship from the U.S. State Department and the Mexican Foreign Ministry. A member of Indiana Council on World Affairs, he has been enormously helpful in identifying speakers for great decisions, as well as bringing students to ICWA's programs. Dr. Snodgrass received a BA at University of Iowa and his MA and PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. Welcome, Dr. Snodgrass.
Thank you very much, Claire. Thank you, Betty. Thanks for the for the greetings. I wish we were in person because I spent 2.5 semesters teaching by Zoom, and so I'm not a huge fan of it, but I deal with it. I'm used to it, and I still have my same background from back in the last time I taught a Mexican history class. So that is, by the way, a postcard from Mexicali, Mexico in the 1920s, which is somewhat relevant for today's talk because back in the 1920s, a lot of Americans started going to places like Mexicali and Tijuana and Havana because you could go there and you could drink rum and beer legally. That was during Prohibition, of course. It was great for the tourism industry in Mexico and Cuba. So I'm going to begin by turning on my screen to share with you. And let me know if you don't see it right now. At least you see that for today's talk. So yeah, I teach Latin American history and international studies at IUPUI. And now when I teach my classes on U.S. Latin American relations or modern Mexico, I always include some lectures and readings related to the war on drugs because it's it's a very important part of Latin America's recent history. And it's also something that our students are really familiar with. So, and I'm familiar with it too, because I've lived in Mexico. I lived in Monterrey, Mexico for over a year in the mid 90s, and then in Guadalajara, Mexico for about a year in 2007. So I lived in two cities that have been kind of on the front lines of the war on drugs, if you will, cities that have suffered the very negative consequences of that conflict from a Mexican perspective. So today what I want to do is kind of talk about what President Nixon referred to for the first time as a war on drugs from the perspective of history. It's been about 50 years since that war was declared. And when he declared the war on drugs, what he really meant was that for the first time, the United States is going to take its efforts to combat illicit trafficking of drugs to a global stage. And there's no two countries that experience that more from then to the present than the Latin American countries of Mexico and Colombia. And those of you who follow, okay, let's see here, American popular culture will be familiar with some aspects of this war on drugs. Today, there's a lot of, some of you may watch the National Geographic station, that network. They seem to be dedicated full-time to showing documentaries related to drug wars and trafficking, and some of them are actually pretty good, particularly a new one they have called Trafficking. There's some very popular Netflix shows related to the drug wars. There's one called Ozark that's very, very popular that deals with the money laundering aspect of the drug industry. There's also one, of course, called Narcos, which obviously is about narcos, first in Colombia, then in Mexico. It's been very popular. It's pretty good because I think personally it's very historically accurate, despite the sort of sensationalism that comes with it. And I would say a lot of Americans are familiar with some of the most renowned narco traffickers. That's what they call them in Latin America. In the United States, we tend to call them drug kingpins or drug lords, various terms like that. But one would be Pablo Escobar from Colombia, who, despite the fact that he was killed in 1993, he's still very widely known. And he was the original protagonist of the first seasons of Narcos. So that's him there on the left, or that's actually the great Brazilian actor Walter Moura portraying Pablo Escobar in that TV show. And then on the right is a more recent famous drug kingpin named Joaquin Guzman, known by his nickname El Chapo or Shorty. And he's famous in the United States because he's the guy that escapes from prison through tunnels and eludes authorities by escaping through tunnels. But he was finally caught, and the United States was finally able to do something that's long tried to do as part of its strategy during the war on drugs, and that is to extradite a major drug kingpin to the United States to put him on trial in the U.S. courts and eventually send him to an American prison. And that is where Shorty is as I speak. And his trial was quite revealing for a number of things, because his trial was just 2 years ago. It was very closely covered, somewhat of a show trial, but it was very interesting trial in that it revealed a lot about the systematic political corruption that operates in Mexico that allows drug trafficking to thrive to this very day. It was very revealing about the methods by which they imported drugs like cocaine into the United States through very legitimate means, through basically tractor trailers. There's also interesting in terms of the nature about how the United States federal government and the DEA pursues these cases in a somewhat, I would say, problematic fashion, in that a lot of the people who actually were provided evidence against him were informants who had worked for his organization, who will get very, very short prison sentences compared to, say, young Americans who get picked up for relatively small amounts of narcotics and will spend years or if not decades in prison, something that we can come back to. So let's begin with the war on drugs. And there's been some real success stories in the last 50 years. It's been going on since 1969. There's been some success stories, but the real reality is that most scholars who study it would say, point out the fact that global production of narcotics like cocaine is at an all-time high. The cartels themselves have been fragmented, but they continually develop new products and new means of global distribution of various drugs. Even cocaine, oftentimes one of for many years, the primary target of the war on drugs. Even cocaine is being produced today at all-time record levels, to the extent that we can measure that. Just in 2019 in Philadelphia, the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, seized a container ship that had 20 tons of cocaine on it, some of which was for the U.S. market, the rest of which was going to go on to Europe. So that just gives you some indication of the extent to which the drug traffickers are still doing pretty good at their part of the game. But to understand the origins of the drug, we have to understand the origins by which drugs were criminalized. A lot of these drugs that were targeted by the drug war when it began, like marijuana and cocaine, were actually legal products in the United States used for both medicinal and recreational uses. Cocaine was not banned until 1920. Up until then, it was widely distributed. You could go to a pharmacy and you can buy it, as you can see here on the left, for a toothache. You can buy it oftentimes with a syringe to accompany it to get a better hit. Marijuana wasn't going to be criminalized until 1937. So well after prohibition of alcohol, we finally see the criminalization of marijuana. And to this very day, the federal government considers marijuana as a controlled substance on the same level as cocaine or heroin. And if you've never seen the movie Reefer Madness, you should watch it, because you'll see the kind of propaganda that came along with the lobbying effort by the prohibitionists to convince the federal government that marijuana was a very dangerous substance that led to violence on the part of its users and therefore needed to be prohibited. And it was, and it still is, since 1937. One of the things, though, we learned from the early attempts to prohibit alcohol was that prohibitions like this create a black market. Black markets create the opportunity for great profits for those who produce and distribute these commodities. It provides a gateway for criminal syndicates to be involved in the production and distribution of the given commodity, and it doesn't necessarily lead to a reduction in consumption. There was more people consuming alcohol by 1933 than there had been when the Volstead Act went into effect in the late 1910s. Something to keep in mind. Richard Nixon was the one who declared war on drugs in 1969. Why then? Why not in 1959? Well, what was going on in 1969 was there was a youthful counterculture rebellion, and historians would point that to one of the factors. Of course, a lot of them were dissidents against his government's policies. There was a lot of evidence that veterans were returning home from Vietnam addicted to heroin, the use of which was widespread, along with opium among troops during that conflict. And then finally, probably the number one thing was there was a lot of rising levels of urban crime. And one of the things that people who studied criminal behavior in cities like Washington, D.C. and New York quickly discovered was that a lot of the people sitting in city jails were heroin addicts, and heroin was a real scourge. And heroin and marijuana are going to be two main drugs targeted by the initial war on drugs. And so when President Nixon made that decision in 1969 to declare war on drugs, among the people who decided to sign up in alliance with him was none other than that gentleman you see there with him in the White House, Elvis Presley. And I want to draw your attention to this website, since a lot of you are interested in foreign affairs and U.S. foreign policy. One of the greatest places you can go to learn more about that is the National Security Archive. And it's a nonprofit organization run out of George Washington University, thus the web address. And what they do is they use the Freedom of Information Act to get access to basically get U.S. government documents from the State Department, the CIA, the DEA, et cetera, declassified and then made available to the public. So if you're interested, for example, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, they have an extensive section of documentation related to that. But the number one thing that people request from the National Security Archive is this picture and the correspondence that relates to it, including the note that Elvis wrote to President Nixon from his hotel asking for this meeting, in which he volunteered to sign up as a special agent of the Bureau of Narcotics. And Richard Nixon, of course, invited him to the White House. He gave him an honorary badge that Elvis would carry with him. Elvis, of course, told Nixon that he was an ideal person to help in this war on drugs because he understood youth culture. He understood the causes of this. He actually blamed in the letter the Beatles as a cause of narcotics consumption, ironically, because he would then go on to cover a lot of Beatles songs in his concerts around that same time. Of course, the irony to this, as you know, is that Elvis Presley sadly became addicted to narcotics himself, to barbiturates in particular, and he ended up dying of a drug overdose in 1977, just a few weeks after he played his very last concert in downtown Indianapolis, Indiana. So that's our local connection. There could be quite a bit more, actually, but we'll keep it at that one. So when the war on drugs began, one of the first major operations involved efforts to eradicate heroin from the American market. And this was one of the early successes. The two major suppliers of heroin to the United States at that time were Turkey and Mexico. So the United States reached out to the Turkish government, then a new NATO ally, and convinced them that they need to carry out a program to eradicate opium poppies from the fields of Turkey and go after the drug traffickers, which they did. Mexico did as well. They eliminated a lot of opium poppy fields and began reducing the exportation of heroin from Mexico into the United States, although that was never complete and that would make quite a comeback. But one of the interesting things about this period of the 1970s was that this is the one time when the US government spent almost as much money treating drug addiction at home as it did fighting a war of drugs abroad. And not coincidentally, it was quite successful. So they had intervention programs to help people who were addicted to heroin. And at the same time, one of the things that we see that proves that this movement was successful was that the street price of heroin gradually begins to go up over the course of the 1970s. And typically that's how the DEA can calculate whether or not its drug interdiction efforts are successful. You look at the street value of a given drug and you see if your operations in Colombia or Mexico are succeeding. In the case of heroin, they did, the price went up, the rates of what had been a very high rate of heroin overdoses dramatically went down. And so too did crime associated with drug addiction. So in the 1970s, that was one early instance of a successful moment in the war on drugs. A less successful moment came then when the United States went after the importation of marijuana from Mexico. By the late 60s and into the early 70s, Mexico becomes the major supplier of marijuana into the United States. It was a rapidly growing market, consumer market. And Mexico was somewhat reluctant to try to convince farmers they needed to uproot their fields. It was a lucrative crop for farmers in Mexico. So the United States government carried out what it called Operation Intercept. And this would be the first time you see this sort of military terminology actually used in the war of drugs. And basically what the United States did was, in order to convince the Mexican government to act, they shut down the border crossings into the United States. Not completely, but they said, we're going to inspect every single car coming into Texas or California. It's going to slow traffic. It's going to slow commerce. And as you can see from that picture on the right, they did find marijuana. That's how they used to smuggle it into the United States in garbage bags in the trunk of cars. But this didn't go over so well because the Mexican government and some other governments in Latin America really didn't like this sort of unilateral means by which they would wage the war on drugs. More importantly, as soon as the United States government began doing this, smugglers adopted new strategies. They began in the 1970s flying marijuana in small planes by air into airstrips in California. And the other thing that happens is that other producers realized there's a growing market for marijuana in the United States, and they too began harvesting the crop. In the United States itself, we see the black market in marijuana really begin to take off in the 1970s, and it is stronger than ever today in places like Northern California. The other people that began growing large numbers of marijuana and smuggling into the United States would be Colombians. Colombian smugglers, growers, farmers. And by the end of the 70s, Colombia is the #1 foreign source of marijuana in the United States. So this is what they often call, people who study the war on drugs called the balloon effect, right? You eradicate the production of the commodity in one area, and the balloon effect is it pops up somewhere else. And that's clearly happened over and over again with efforts to eradicate cocaine production in places like Colombia. So one of the things that happens though during this time period is that, marijuana was a lucrative commodity to bring into the United States, but it was bulky and the profits weren't as great as what's going to be another drug whose the market for which, demand for which is really going to begin to take off beginning in the late 1970s. And that is going to be cocaine. And I don't know if any of you have ever seen this movie called Blobe with Johnny Depp. It's a great movie based on the real history of how it is that a major American marijuana smuggler decided to pivot and instead ally himself with the Medellin cartel and become a major smuggler of cocaine from Colombia through the Caribbean into the United States market. It was a really, really pivotal moment that shows a lot about how cocaine really became the #1 drug of choice for the narco traffickers. And why is it that cocaine suddenly takes off in the mid-1970s? Well, among drug users in the United States, heroin, speed, they were considered to be very, very dangerous drugs. On the other hand, drugs like marijuana and cocaine were seen to be casual drugs, recreational drugs with limited health effects. Cocaine itself was seen to be, at that time, relatively non-addictive, kind of a party drug. And the profits of cocaine, of course, were immense compared to the profits you can make from smuggling heroin into the United States. So if you follow this story, this American smuggler named George Young, he was a guy who as a young man began flying chartered planes full of marijuana into airstrips in Southern California. He eventually gets arrested, gets sent to a federal penitentiary in Connecticut, and lo and behold, his cellmate is a German Colombian guy named Carlos Later, who is working with what's going to become the Medellin cartel. And he tells Mr. Young, boy, you're wasting your time with marijuana. The real money's in cocaine, and there's a growing demand for it. And we have access to immense amounts of the product. It's just a matter of figuring out how to get it into the United States. And thus begins the moment when cocaine becomes the #1 drug coming into the United States and the #1 target for the DEA. The profits of cocaine by the late 1970s and into the 1980s were immense. The street value in the United States was about 50 times greater than the wholesale value of cocaine in Colombia. So the profits were so large that the DEA itself estimated that they could interdict 90% of the cocaine coming through the Caribbean, and the smugglers would still be making a profit. So that's a pretty good business deal from the perspective of the narcotraficantes. The other thing, of course, that happens during this time period is that the drug traffickers themselves begin fighting for control of the transshipment routes, particularly in South Florida. And some of you of a certain age might remember the time when by the late 70s and into the 80s, South Florida and Miami had by far the highest murder rate of any city in the United States by far. And a lot of it was drug trafficking gangs fighting for control of this very, very profitable transshipment point. And one of the things that kind of comes out of that is that, of course, from that, we're going to get to the 1990s with the crack epidemic. So an ongoing increase in demand for cocaine. And one solution at home, of course, will become mass incarceration, comes in the 90s. But the second thing, of course, is going to be really trying to figure out how the United States government can work with its allies in Latin America to bring an end to this market. So the author of the reading you guys did for today, she really focuses on the kind of, I would say, high-level international relations aspect of this whole drug policy. And that's important because U.S. policy very much depends upon diplomacy. At the end of the day, we're working with governments in Mexico, Colombia, jointly, cooperatively, to go after the so-called cartels. And so how they do that, this means you can see here on the left, all these different U.S. agencies involved in the war on drugs. At the global level, there would be a lot more if we were just talking about the war on drugs at the domestic level, but you've got the DEA, the Customs and Border, the U.S. State Department. They always have to be involved. So whether we're sending new radar technology to Colombia or military technology to Mexico, the U.S. State Department, our diplomats are always kind of on the front lines of making those transfers. The Navy's involved to this very day with very, very high level, high-tech surveillance, trying to look at where cocaine is being produced, how it's being shipped. The Coast Guard then is sent in, or our Latin American allies, to try to intercept these drug shipments. The U.S. Treasury Department and the IRS are very much involved in this process. They try to go after the profit repatriation side of the business, which means money laundering. A very, very, very sophisticated business. If you consider that we're talking about an industry that generates tens of billions of dollars every year, that money has to be transformed into legitimate money. And a lot of accountants and bankers work with these drug cartels to make it all possible. So it's another ongoing challenge, and it's costly. So let's talk about some of the means by which the war on drugs actually plays out in places like Latin America. Well, the first thing you try to do is interdiction. All right, stop the flow of drugs by land, by air, by sea. And initially, when it was the war on drugs against Colombian cocaine, it was mainly coming through the Caribbean basin. So that's how you get the Coast Guard, the Navy involved, trying to stop it from coming in. But if you jump ahead today, by the early 2000s, drug users and distributors in the United States are actually acquiring narcotics through the so-called dark web. I mean, it would have taken a science fiction writer back in the 1980s to even imagine a dark web by which you went online through encrypted messaging services and you paid for the narcotics with a currency known as cryptocurrency. But that's where we are today. So it's an ongoing challenge for the drug warriors to keep up with these traffickers. But the real challenge is that drug traffickers make immense profits, and they invest that in engineers and technology to always keep one step ahead of all of these different agencies, be they American or be they European, that are trying to intercept drugs. And they come up with remarkably ingenious methods to transship drugs. Among the more famous recently are the construction of fiberglass semi-submersibles, submarines essentially, being produced in places like Colombia to transship cocaine up along the Pacific coast into Central America, to Mexico, the United States, also now being used to transport cocaine into places like Spain. Just 2 years ago, the Spanish government found a scuttled submarine off the northwest coast of Spain that had 3 tons of cocaine in it. So those are the ones they find. You can imagine the ones they don't find. In Spain, they've recently been catching a lot of women flying into airports like Madrid with cocaine in their breast implants. They more recently came across a case where traffickers were shipping cocaine into Spain and thus into Europe by means of crates full of tropical fruits like limes and pineapples. The cocaine wasn't hidden in the fruit, it was actually hidden in the cardboard box itself, where chemists had created a liquefied form of cocaine, sprayed it inside the cardboard, put the box together, shipped it to Spain, along with Colombian chemists, who then were able to take that cardboard box, take it apart and extract the liquefied cocaine and transform it into powder cocaine. And from there, it would go to the Netherlands, which has now become the primary transshipment point for cocaine and many other drugs in Europe. So this is an ongoing struggle. But one of the things that came out of the trial of Chapo Guzman in New York a couple of years ago was the very legitimate means by which most of these drugs are shipped today. Since the 90s, we've lived in the era of globalization. We've seen a tremendous increase of container ships on the seas. So as I mentioned, that big bust in Philadelphia was cocaine hidden away in a container ship. But one of the things that Chapo Guzman pointed out was that while his organization is famous for building tunnels under the U.S. Mexican border, he pointed out that most of the drugs that we sent into the United States came on semi-tractor trailers to places like Laredo, Texas, where 15,000 such trucks cross north every day. And the DEA and Customs and Border Patrol have these huge X-ray machines that you can put a truck in, but they can't put all 15,000 trucks in that machine. So he was very honest that, a lot of the drugs that we were bringing into the United States, the cocaine was coming in, for example, in large wholesale size cans of jalapeno peppers. So it's hard to keep up with these guys. So drug interdiction is always going to be a challenge, just because the traffickers have so much money, they can hire some remarkably ingenious engineers and always stay one step ahead of the people trying to intercept the drugs. So the other thing that they try to do is eradication. So with cocaine, with marijuana, with heroin, your raw material are basically our plants, right? It's opium, it's the coca plant. In the case of cocaine, that's the plant right there. So it's a plant that grows, it's a small bush, it's grown in the Andean parts of Colombia, of Bolivia, of Peru. In Bolivia, it's legal. It's been used since pre-Columbian times by indigenous peoples in the Andes. Once you apply chemicals to it in a laboratory, then it becomes cocaine. But the raw material, in the end of the day, is this plant. So one of the strategies has always been the eradication of the coca plant. That, of course, requires, the cooperation of the Colombian authorities. And there's been a lot of attempts to do so in Colombia. They'll go in for a long time. They use basically Roundup, and they would fly planes over the fields, and they would drop Roundup, and they would try to kill it off. And every time they did that, of course, they'd kill off the livelihood of small farmers for whom coca is a very, very lucrative crop. And what happens is, again, the balloon effect. You can wipe out the coca fields in one part of Colombia, and the traffickers will go to another region, convince farmers there to begin harvesting the plant, or they go to Peru, or they go to Bolivia. And that's the balloon effect. And it's well known that last year it's estimated that Colombia had its largest harvest of coca ever. So much for eradication. But that image there on the right kind of gives you an indication of what the Colombian perspective often is on this process. It's like, you're going after the livelihoods of these small farmers who are producing a crop that we've raised and harvested for literally for centuries. And meanwhile, what's it going through? It's going up the nose of the Americans, who have this insatiable demand for cocaine. But in the case of Colombia, the other thing that's going to be the focus of these operations will be extradition, right? Going after the highest level drug traffickers, and not just capturing them, but convincing governments like that of Mexico to Colombia to extradite them to the United States to put them on trial here. And that's how we get to really what's the interesting story of Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel. This term cartel, as you hear it all the time, and it's somewhat of a misnomer because there's really not a lot of genuine cartels anymore. So many drug kingpins have been arrested. A lot of the cartels have fragmented beyond the point where we can talk about them as cartels. But Medellin was a cartel. And it began when these various gangs based in this city that's famous for its entrepreneurship. And Medellin has long been a city famous for industrialists and ranchers. It was an entrepreneurial city. It's got that culture. And when cocaine became something, they grasped onto it quickly. But initially, in the 1980s, you had a whole bunch of different Colombian gangs based in Medellin, all trying to fight for the market in the United States, until they all came together and through a joint agreement, they basically created a monopoly. Let's work together and divide the transshipment routes. Let's work together and build the biggest cocaine labs we've ever seen. Let's work together to have a joint account where we bribe officials to leave us alone. And if necessary, let's work together to create a paramilitary force that will go after officials who trample on our interests. And that's the role that Pablo Escobar plays. Initially, he was the guy that trained the assassins who carried out a lot of the attacks on government officials who tried to go after this cartel. But it was a cartel in that they had a monopoly on production, global distribution, profit repatriation. So if you could bring down somebody like Pablo Escobar, you're really going to have a real impact on the cocaine trade in general. And so that's what they did, and they went after him. And the real trick was trying to convince Colombian officials that the days in which you arrest these guys and put them in sort of country club prisons has to end. You need to extradite them to the United States. And once the Colombian government agreed to do that, the Medellin cartel went after the government. And by the early 1990s, the people of Colombia were experiencing the effects of that. They carried out bombing campaigns against civilians in Bogota. They assassinated a presidential candidate. They assassinated the Minister of Justice. They paid a guerrilla organization to take over the Ministry of Justice itself, the entire building. So they really went after this in order to resist extradition. And in the end, Pablo Escobar's fate came when he was captured in the neighborhood where he lived in Medellin, and you can see how he ended up right there. But they put up a strong amount of resistance to this. And even when he was dead, that didn't end cocaine production, right? It increased, and we know that because the value of cocaine in the United States didn't change at all. And this was followed by what they called Plan Colombia, a very formal U.S. foreign policy by which each year we gave about $1 billion or so to the Colombian government, provided them with training by U.S. special forces to go after drug traffickers, provided them with very, very high-tech weaponry like Black Hawk helicopters, carried out the eradication program. all of these kind of things. And, by the late 90s, Colombia, in the early 2000s, Colombia was receiving more foreign aid from the United States than any country in the world other than Israel and Egypt, all to wage the war against drugs. And it was very controversial because this is also the time when in Colombia, the government was carrying out a lot of human rights abuses. A lot of labor activists were being killed. Land reform activists were killed. Many members of Congress were like, what are we doing giving money to fight a war on drugs when this government's kind of becoming renowned for human rights abuses? But that was playing Colombia, and it was very controversial at the time. And in the end of the day, as I said, the Medellin cartel, the Cali cartel that followed, you never really hear about them anymore. And what instead you have in Colombia is a massive fragmentation of the criminal organizations who are now involved in the drug trade. So it's even more hard to go after them now than it was back in the days of the genuine cartels. And then that leads us to Mexico, because one of the great successes of the war on drugs in terms of interdiction was that they did cripple the capacity of Colombian cocaine traffickers to move the product through the Caribbean basin into South Florida. And so as that was happening, there's various versions of the story. Either Mexican cartel members went to the Colombians or vice versa, but eventually what happened was the Colombians said, well, the Mexicans have a long history of smuggling commodities into and out of the United States, and they have their own transshipment points, and maybe we can cooperate with them, give them the cocaine, and let them smuggle it into the United States. And that's how we got to the point where we are today, where 90% of the cocaine that comes into the United States comes in through Mexico. And one of the things that the Colombians did was that rather than simply pay the Mexicans a commission for moving the cocaine, they paid them in cocaine. So the Mexican cartels essentially became traffickers in cocaine in their own right, and jumped from the 1990s when this alliance first went into effect until today. Today, the Mexican drug cartels are far more powerful than the Colombian counterparts, and they've become more globalized. They're often the ones now that are trafficking cocaine into places like, as far flung as Australia and Spain and the Netherlands. But one of the things about that process is that, of course, the Mexican traffickers they were still trafficking somewhat in marijuana. They were still trafficking heroin. Now they simply have another commodity that was going to be even more lucrative. And back in the 1990s, this system worked very, very well from the perspective of the Mexican traffickers. And again, back in the 1990s, you could talk about genuine cartels in Mexico, in that Guadalajara and these other regions you see in the map on the left, they really did have a tight control over production, distribution, money laundering, and all these kind of things. And basically, for a long time, you had four cartels. One based in Guadalajara that's often today called the Sinaloa cartel, that controlled a lot of the actual production of drugs like heroin and marijuana. And then you had three cartels that controlled the different transshipment points into the United States. The Tijuana cartel, for obvious reasons, the Juarez cartel, controlling entry into El Paso, that region there, and then what was often called the Gulf cartel that controlled the transshipment points into South Texas and through the Gulf of Mexico. And they basically had in the 1990s and into the early 2000s what we could call a kind of narco peace, in which they all agreed that we're going to respect each other's transshipment points, we're going to work together, and we're going to work together to corrupt as many Mexican government officials as we possibly can. And I can tell you, when I lived in Mexico for the first time in the mid-1990s in Monterrey, everybody knew what was going on. Everybody knew that the government of Carlos Salinas, who was president then, was extraordinarily corrupt. Journalists would write about it. Everybody knew who was taking the money, including Carlos Salinas, the president's own brother, who they later found out had tens of millions of dollars hidden away in Swiss bank accounts. And the other thing was the cartels had an agreement that Monterrey was going to be a neutral territory. So when I lived in Monterrey in the mid-1990s, everybody knew that certain neighborhoods were heavily inhabited by the families of some of the leading drug trafficking cartels in Mexico. They had an agreement that Monterrey would be neutral territory. Our families could live there. They have great schools in Monterrey. It's a very wealthy city, one of the wealthiest in all of Latin America. There's good shopping there. It's close to the US, and we're not going to interfere with each other. Right? We can live there. We can live in peace. The government will understand that. And this system worked very, very well from the Mexican perspective, because Mexico itself was not experiencing the kind of violence that we would see break out in Colombia once those two big cartels collapsed. And of course, everything's going to change in Mexico when it becomes the target of the US's war on drugs. And it begins putting pressure on the Mexican government to begin going after these cartels. And then you have a change of ruling parties in Mexico. So that old ruling party that ruled Mexico throughout a good part of the 20th century was finally defeated in the year 2000. There goes our cooperative government in Mexico City. And beginning in 2006, you get a Mexican government who basically said, now we're going to declare war against the drug cartels ourselves. And in 2006, the Mexican government began arresting some of the biggest kingpins in that country, putting them in prison. Chapo Guzman was first arrested during this time period. And one of the effects of that was the splintering of these cartels and an escalation of violence as the cartels fought to control the territories that they once all kind of agreed upon. And then you get the emergence of new criminal syndicates. Syndicates like the one in green you see there called Los Zetas. They had been sort of the paramilitary wing of the Gulf cartel. It was made up of former members of the Mexican Special Forces, all of whom had been trained by American Special Forces. They also recruited many also US trained members of the Guatemalan Special Forces who had fought in the Civil War there in the 1980s. So people with some genuine military skills are hired on as a paramilitary force. And eventually they came into conflict with the leaders of the Gulf cartel and decide, we don't really need you. We're going to take over your territories ourselves. So boom, there comes an explosion of violence. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the level of violence that Mexico has experienced as these old cartels have broken apart and begun fighting for turf and territory, and have also branched out into other equally lucrative criminal enterprises, such as kidnapping Central American migrants and holding them for extortion, stealing gas out of pipelines as they pass through Mexico, extorting small businessmen throughout the country, et cetera, et cetera. It's really, Mexico has seen an explosion of violence. And so it's one place today where, when we talk about a war on drugs, the victims are very much living through the streets of Mexico. And it's a real tragedy. And I can tell you I lived in Guadalajara in 2007. And during that time, I was doing field research and traveled in my a car very frequently through parts of much of Jalisco and Guanajuato. And I can tell you today, I would not think of driving through some of the roads and visiting the towns I did back then, because the level of violence has become so extraordinary in parts of Mexico that used to be famously very, very peaceful. Monterrey experienced this as well. And Monterrey was famously in the 90s considered probably the safest big city in all of Latin America. And by the early 2000s, it was really engulfed in this kind of violence that we see today. So that's kind of where we are today. And interesting enough, here's where we are as well. Remember, one of the first big targets of the war on drugs, marijuana, that evil drug, reefer madness. Well, here's where we are today. We could get in our cars tomorrow morning and drive to Danville, Illinois. That's the closest place where there's a retail marijuana dispensary. We could buy it legally. So today, there's 18 states in the US where anybody can go into a retail shop as long as you're over 21 and you can buy marijuana or various marijuana byproducts, right? Including very popular states like California. So that's where we are today. And meanwhile, the other thing that's happened, it's easy to go after drugs like cocaine, despite the limited success there, marijuana. Why would drug cartels worry about trying to smuggle marijuana into the United States now when it's legal? There's no longer any profit to be made, and there's a lot of risk moving a bulky commodity like that. Even raising heroin is always a risk because you can eradicate the opium fields. So now what the Mexican drug cartels have gone into is producing something that Americans have long been producing, which are synthetic opioids. You guys all know about the OxyContin epidemic we had, over-the-counter pharmaceuticals that many Americans became addicted to. Then heroin became a scourge. Then it's been replaced by fentanyl and new forms of methamphetamines produced in labs in Mexico with chemicals that are readily available. Fentanyl, of course, has great medicinal uses, but the precursor components that go into making fentanyl are readily available out there in the market, right? So you can't really close off the markets to those components. And now they're being produced in Mexico and shipped into the United States. And the end result is, as you guys probably know, actually record levels of overdoses. Last year, we saw more Americans die of drug overdoses than we've ever seen in recorded history. And one of the consequences is that is a real decline in the growth of population. But the U.S. still spends, after 50 years, about $50 billion annually in the war on drugs, both at home, domestically, and abroad. The street value of cocaine has not changed in the United States since the 1980s, and it is still widely consumed. The U.S. is still the largest market in the world for cocaine, even as new markets have been opened up in places like Europe and Brazil. The variety of illicit drugs, methamphetamines, fentanyl, has only grown over the years. And as I mentioned, drug overdoses in the United States are at an all-time high. So I'll leave it to you guys to determine whether or not the war on drugs has been successful and whether or not we should continue it for another 50 years. Thank you, and now I'll be happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to try and manage the question and answers here a little bit. So if you would, if you have a question you'd like to ask Michael, please address it to me. And if you'd like to ask it personally, just say, I have a question, and I'll call on you to ask your question. So one of the questions that came up initially had to do with the legalization of marijuana in the United States. And you've already kind of addressed that a little bit. Has that affected seriously the flow of marijuana across the border, or is this?
Yeah, oh yeah, it has. But the other thing that has too is the building of the border wall.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that began that really didn't begin until after 9/11. I mean, there was some walls put up in El Paso and San Diego area, but the real border wall has really gone up a lot in the early 2000s, and that's made it a lot harder to smuggle. I mean, marijuana is a bulky product. The profit margin is much lower than it would on cocaine or heroin. So, there's, for logical reasons, drug smugglers are doing that. And the other thing, that even before recreational marijuana was decriminalized in much of the United States, the production of marijuana within the United States had escalated dramatically. Mm-hmm. And that's been going on since the 70s. And Northern California in particular is a major producer of marijuana, particularly in the federal forest lands up there in Northern California. So in many ways, the market was still there and it's still growing even before legalization, but it's being satisfied by producers more within the United States than without the United States.
Okay.
I hope that answers the question.
Yes.
But one of the interesting things is that you find, and is even in the case of the United States with the legalization, in many parts of the United States, people who consume marijuana still prefer to buy black market marijuana. It costs a lot less. Sometimes it's better, and there's a wide variety of it out there. There's still really tight regulations in terms of who can produce and harvest marijuana, and a lot of growers find it a lot easier to go to federal forest lands and plant it and harvest it there. Including, I should point out, getting back to the Mexico connection, a lot of the marijuana that's being harvested in the counties of Northern California is actually being harvested by the Mexican cartels. But long ago, 15 years ago, they started sending people out there. And that's why it can be very, very dangerous to go trekking up in the national forest in Northern California or Oregon, because they set up booby traps and they stay there with their AK-47s watching over their plots. So like I said, that's an indication though of just how profitable that black market marijuana is versus the highly regulated, highly taxed marijuana that is sold at these dispensaries.
Okay, very good, thank you. Claire had a question about the fentanyl being shipped into Mexico from China. Mm-hmm. Is that an issue that we're addressing?
We're definitely trying to. That's a really good one, because that's become, fentanyl is, looking back in hindsight of 50 years ago, we probably would be way better off if the number of drugs coming in from Mexico were marijuana and heroin, because they don't kill the way fentanyl does. And you guys probably all know fentanyl is a highly deadly substance. And fentanyl kind of took off around the time when, it became a little bit more hard to get OxyContin, and heroin dealers in the United States first began bringing fentanyl into the US directly from China. So that's that dark web. So for a long time, it was widely available in China and chemists were making it there. And the Chinese government wasn't doing a whole lot to interfere with that. And so a lot of American heroin traffickers in particular were through this dark web, using Bitcoin and things like that, were able to purchase it. It was arriving in the mail from China. And then they were using that to put in heroin. And eventually, and this is all relatively recent because it was the Trump administration that as soon as they came into office, put a lot of pressure on the Chinese government to say, you've got to cut down on these chemists producing fentanyl and shipping it directly into the US. And that's how then, of course, we get the very ingenious Mexican traffickers saying, here's our opportunity, because we can get access to the precursor chemicals that are used to make fentanyl. And from what I understand, there's a variety of different recipes, chemical recipes you can use to make fentanyl. It's widely used as medicinal, so you can't really eliminate access to these chemicals. And it doesn't take long for the Mexican cartels to enlist some Mexican or other chemists, including from Europe, to come in and open up, build labs, and start mass producing fentanyl. And then what they've been doing in order to ship it into the United States is that they're pressing it into pills, oftentimes pills that are in the shape of OxyContin or other commonly used opioids. So that's how we get this epidemic of overdoses that throughout the United States over the last 5 years, we've got young kids going and buying a pill to party for the night. It turns out it's laden with fentanyl and they're dead within an hour. Yeah. But it's one of those things. It's like this, and it used to be like the other drug that used to come into the United States from Mexico was crystal meth. Well, crystal meth used to be widely produced in the United States. And you guys might remember when even in Indianapolis, cops would bust crystal meth labs in abandoned houses all the time. That was common when I moved here in 2000, because all you needed to make crystal meth was ephedrine. And you could get ephedrine when you bought cold medicine at CVS. That's why today we have to go to CVS. If you want to buy cold medicine, you have to sign all these forms, and you can only buy so much. Well, for a long time then, ephedrine disappeared from the United States and it was available in Mexico. So the Mexican cartels started making methamphetamines until the Mexican government actually shut that down as well. Now they've come up with a new recipe for methamphetamine, and they use a chemical compound whose name I can't remember, but they call it P2P. It's a very long term. That's chemist, and it's widely available. And some chemists in Mexico have come up with this new recipe for methamphetamine, and now that is flooding into the U.S. market. Right? They call it meth P2P. And there's this author named Sam Quinones, right, a really great investigative reporter who has a new book out on this new form of crystal meth, how it originated, and some of its really, really devastating effects. Not as bad as fentanyl because it doesn't kill people outright. They don't OD on it. But unlike the old crystal meth that people used to use kind of as a party drug, it was basically a high-grade amphetamine. This new one has real psychotic hallucinatory effects on its users. And particularly a lot of young men are using it. It causes, even when they're not high, they have intense paranoia. They constantly have to be moving around. And if you go to the West Coast today, I was just out in California about 10 days ago. There's a proliferation, not just of homeless camps, but of homeless tent camps. All these young people, you'll see them, you go by underpasses in the Bay Area, for example, there's just tents lined up everywhere. And what Quinones argues is that almost all these people living in these tents are young men who become addicted to this new form of crystal meth, P2P. They want to be in tents because you want to be by yourself when you're doing this drug. They all have bicycles because they want to be riding bikes around. And he said this is one of the worst scourges in terms of a narcotic entering into our market that we've maybe ever seen. And he says, ironically, he goes, if you try to reach out to them, none of them want to be helped. That's that addictive. And he basically argues that the only solution, and he's one of these people who's really against mass incarceration, but he says for these people, a lot of them, the only solution is to be arrested and throw them in jail, because that's the only way they can get off it. But this is going to be a new challenge. So the Claire brought that up, the question of fentanyl. The real challenge is that these are synthetic drugs. So you can't eradicate the plants that they're derived from. This is made from chemicals that are widely available. They're used for a lot of medicinal and industrial uses. And as long as you have chemists willing to manufacture them, they're going to be produced in Mexico. And as long as when it's it's a small little pill, you can imagine how easy that is to smuggle into the United States.
All right, thank you. Lois Meyer has a question, and she wants to ask it herself. Los?
Thank you. Thank you for this talk. It's sobering. But do you have an opinion about the present lawsuit that the Mexican government has brought against the United States gun interests, accusing the gun interests of supplying cheap guns to the cartels and blaming those guns for the violence that Mexico is undergoing? What is your thought about that?
Actually, I wasn't aware that there was a lawsuit.
Oh, wow. Yes.
I think there's some lawsuits like that in the United States too. But that lawsuit would, I guess it's not completely surprising because it's well known. I kind of mentioned earlier on when I talked about the old traditional Mexican cartels that they were always involved in smuggling products both out of and into Mexico from the United States. And there's been a lot of products over the years, but most recently one would be firearms. And I know it's estimated that when I was reading up on this over the weekend, about the 200,000 firearms alone are imported into Mexico every year. And it's become easier and easier because our laws in terms of purchasing weapons have become laxer and laxer. And so the smuggling of both weapons and ammunition into Mexico has escalated dramatically because, of course, there's a demand for them. You know, as these different gangs have splintered, as they become more violent, as they fought amongst themselves for territory, as they fought against local and federal military and police forces, there's your demand for guns. But certainly in Mexico, I should go back by saying, in Mexico, it is very difficult to acquire a firearm. The only way you can legally purchase a firearm in Mexico is if you're involved in, security forces for the government, right? A cop, or if you're a hunter. You know, hunting is a big sport in Mexico the way it is here. And so hunters are able to go get hunting rifles and get a license for that. But otherwise, you cannot go into a store and buy a handgun in Mexico or ammunition. That's impossible. So the only way these people can get their weapons is going to be from the United States. And it's well known, it's been well documented that particularly in Texas and Arizona, one of the things that cartels do is that they have people on our side of the border enlisting young men, because in those states, when you're 18, you can go in and buy a weapon at Walmart, questions unasked. And then you can go to the next Walmart and buy another one. And what they do is they get these young men, promise them a little bit of money, go buy the weapons, and then drive them into Mexico. Because if you're an American driving into Mexico, the odds of you having your car searched closely are much less than vice versa. And northern Mexican prisons are full of young Americans who've gotten caught doing this. So it is happening. I don't really have an opinion about the lawsuit, but I would agree with the Mexican government that, gun manufacturers know this is going on. Right? They know where their weapons are being sold. They know there's not that high of a demand for all these weapons in South Texas or Tucson. So they all know what's going on. So it'll be interesting to see how this thing plays out in the courts.
Yeah, thank you. And I just will mention that I'm in New Mexico. So we hear a lot about this lawsuit.
Yeah, I bet you do. And I bet you in New Mexico, I don't know what your gun laws are there. I know Texas and Arizona are the places where they do this a lot, but this has been controversial for a really long time. You guys may have heard a case about 10 years ago when the ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency, they kind of began working with the DEA. They came up with this plan. It's like, if we can put these high-powered rifles, and sometimes some of the rifles, the AR-15s and things like that, they actually allowed them to be smuggled into Mexico based upon the idea that we're going to put little computer chips in them. And if we follow the guns, they'll take us to the narcos. That's what they did. And then it turned out that the exact guns were used to kill a bunch of cops and other government officials before the whole thing kind of blew up in the ATF's face. It's like, whoops, we lost track of those guns.
Wow.
I think they called it Operation Fast and Furious.
Yeah.
If you want to look that up, you'll probably learn more about this. And, probably things like that would probably help the Mexican government, kind of inspire the Mexican government to maybe be, to figure out some kind of solution.
Yeah.
By the way, there was one thing on my screen that I didn't share, and I'm going to now. And that was, I thought if you guys are interested in learning more about some of these issues, here's a couple of great authors and books. That book on the left, How to Run a Drug Cartel. I read that, I think, 2 years ago in order to, when I first started lecturing it to my students. And so what Wainwright does, he says, look, we need to look at some of these in an industry like cocaine as it's a global industry, and it's a big business, and it's a remarkable business if you consider that it's depending on whose figures you want to follow, maybe a $40 billion annual business, $30 to $40 billion annual business that's producing and distributing at a global level an illicit drug, despite the fact that you have the U.S. government and Interpol and all these other governments trying to stop it. This industry still thrives, and so it's a very sophisticated industry. And if you look at it that way, it's a mix for an interesting business model. So Narconomics is a really, really interesting, very well researched book. There's a lot of really bad literature out there on the war on drugs and the drug trafficking, kind of sensationalistic stuff. But the other author I'd really highly recommend is a British author who's long lived in Mexico. He's an investigative journalist who literally risked his life to do a lot of the reporting, and he does. But he has 3 different books. This was his first one that really made a name for him, called El Narco. It's about the rise of the Mexican drug cartels. He has another one that came out more recently called Gangster Warlords, that looks at the other criminal enterprises they've branched off into in Mexico. And then he has another one related to gun smuggling. Lois, you might find interesting, Blood, Gun, Money. That's his newest one, and it deals with the smuggling of weapons from the United States into Mexico. And Ian Grillo, you can read. He's also a regular writer for the New York Times. So if you kind of put his name in a New York Times, you can read all of his opinion pieces. He's long been writing for them, not just about the drug trade, but about other issues related to Mexican politics and particularly to corruption. Because if you want to understand how it is that these so-called cartels can thrive, you have to understand the political system in Mexico that leaves it so open to literally remarkable, staggering levels of corruption. I mean, there's corruption on the U.S. side. If you follow what goes on in U.S. federal courts in places like South Texas, there's a lot of cases of border and customs agents running through those federal courts because they are susceptible to being bought off too. And we all know that happens. But in Mexico, it is a whole nother level. So one of the things that came out of El Chapo Guzman's trial that he mentioned was that the Sinaloa cartel had a $1 million a month they set aside for bribing Mexican government officials. $1 million a month. That's how much money they have to throw around. The other thing they have to throw around is the threat of violence. So if you're a local cop or a mayor, over the last decade, over 200 municipal government officials have been assassinated in Mexico, mayors. So if you're a local cop or a federal police officer, are you going to work for or against these people, knowing that at any time they can go after you or your family? And they know about the families. So it's one of these things that's intractable. They're willing to use both massive amounts of money and remarkably brutal levels of violence to maintain their enterprises, and that's one of the reasons why it's thrived. And the violence is something that to me is sometimes staggering, and having lived in Mexico for over 3 years, sometimes it's hard to comprehend. How it is that you recruit young men to carry out these levels of violence, and we're talking torture, decapitations. I mean, really, really brutal stuff to intimidate people, and it's a mystery, and it's ravaging Mexico. But again, these are 2 really good reading recommendations I would want to leave you with.
All right, thank you. Hey, Betty, I think you had a question you wanted to ask?
Very quick question. Michael, you had mentioned Guanajuato. I'm looking for you on my screen here. I can see you.
Over here now.
There you are. Okay, thank you. Amidst the gallery. I spent some time in Guanajuato. It was fantastic. When has it become that violent now?
Guanajuato has, yes.
I was in Guanajuato probably in 07, 08. So has this happened since then?
That's when I was there too. I did a lot of my research in Guanajuato. And I've always loved Guanajuato. Even when I lived in Mexico City, we'd drive up to Guanajuato on weekends. It's one of the most charming, beautiful parts of Mexico.
It is.
It really is. The city of Guanajuato, San Miguel, these old colonial mining cities that are just beautiful. And it's a very thriving state. It's now one of the main centers of Mexico's auto industry.
Yeah.
It's got a lot of industry. It's a famous, old mining towns. A lot of American expatriates live there.
Yes, a university city, a UNESCO heritage site. And you're saying that that violent now that you would be concerned?
So what was for a long time probably one of the single most peaceful states in Mexico, back when I lived there in 2007, now has become, along with Zacatecas right next door, a major centers of violence. Because if you think about it, those are, they're crossroads. That's central Mexico. So a lot of things are moving through there, and that's why there's and it's a region that's never really, because it was never really part of any cartel-controlled region. Now the cartels are fighting to control it. There's a new cartel that emerged in Guadalajara. It's called they call themselves Jalisco New Generation, right? Because initially the original cartel in Mexico, when there was a really cartel, was based in Guadalajara. So in 1990, Guadalajara was the center of everything. You had those smaller ones along the borderlands, but the big one was Guadalajara. And if you watch Narcos, you'll see that in the first episode of Narcos Mexico. That's really a very accurate account of what Guadalajara was. But Guanajuato, they had nothing. Guanajuato has become a big place they're fighting over because it's a crossroads. A lot of the major highways go through Guanajuato. So that's one reason why they're fighting to control that. It's also the state through which a lot of the gas pipelines travel. So the gas pipelines going from northern Mexico, there's big oil fields there, down to Mexico City, and from the Gulf Coast to some major refineries in Guanajuato. And one of the more lucrative criminal enterprises today is tapping into those gas lines, right? Taking the gas and selling it on the black market. And that's one of the reasons why Guanajuato has really exploded in violence.
It's really too bad.
Yeah.
Yes.
It is. And that's like I said, I would be kind of reluctant to go driving through those parts of Mexico, even though for the most part, Americans are, nobody's going after Americans, right?
Well,
These criminal gangs know better. It's one of those things like if you go after an American, then you get the State Department involved, then the embassy's involved. So why even mess with it? But there's areas today that the other area that's really exploded into violence recently, and this has a lot to do with the retail drug market, is the Cancun region of Mexico, all on the so-called Riviera Maya, Cancun, Tulum, Playa del Carmen, that area. And there's been a lot of fights among different drug gangs, not so much for trafficking reasons, but because in places like Cancun, there's a huge retail market for cocaine. All those tourists, they want to go down there and have fun, and they want to party. So there's a lot of fighting that's been going on there. And I mentioned that because that is the one area, particularly the city of Tulum, south of Cancun, where there has been over the past year, some American and Canadian and European tourists actually killed, getting caught in the crossfire. Bad, very, very bad for business in Mexico, because Mexico depends very heavily on tourism. And so it doesn't take many incidents like that, some Europeans being killed in a bar when gangs are shooting it out, to really, really decimate that industry.
Well, Mexico has a wonderful, as you know, a wonderful rich history of culture, literature, art, music, ancient ruins. It has everything. Beauty. It's just a study. And I've said so often to people since they came back, you want to get to Guanajuato. I mean, it is just marvelous. And you won't, all these horrible things you hear about Mexico, it's just in regions. It's not everywhere. So I'm thinking, I'll stop telling that story now. It's too bad.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it'll change. And that's kind of what's been happening ever since 2006, when the violence really escalated. It kind of is getting this like balloon effect. One city suddenly is engulfed in violence, and then 2 years later, it's back. Monterrey today is not anywhere where it was 10 years ago. So Monterrey, I wouldn't worry about going to Monterrey at all right now. Things have calmed down there. Hopefully the same thing will happen in Guanajuato.
All right, Jack had a question. He said, given the many decades of failed U.S. drug policy with focus on prohibition and enforcement, why has the emphasis not moved more towards treatment approach with more funding directed to various programs for drug consumers?
I wish I had the answer to that. I honestly do. Because on the domestic front, what has been the main policy front has been, what today we call mass incarceration. In the beginning of the 1990s, the policy became, let's crack down hard on the people who are low-level retail drug dealers, very, very high prison rates for people selling a little bit of cocaine on the streets, 10, 20 years. Then we had the 3 strikes you're outlaws, where, 3 times in your life sentence. And you guys all know the explosion of prison population in the United States beginning in the 1990s. It's not as if the people working for the remember we have drug czars now. That's a relatively small office, but those people there, they have to read the literature, and they have to know that it's a public health crisis, and a public health crisis insists upon something other than draconian, harsh measures, law enforcement measures. It has to be dealt with as a public health crisis, and that's something that's been put forth for a long time. And in the end of the day, it just doesn't happen. They don't want to dedicate those resources.
Yeah.
But I'm sure that the people that make our policy, they're aware of that. As I said, in the 1970s, that was the time when, let's open up. In the 70s, when we had this high levels of heroines, when they opened up, methadone clinics to help people wean themselves off of their addiction to heroin, and it worked. Today, when there's efforts to try to maybe distribute needles so people aren't transmitting HIV/AIDS while they're using drugs, there's massive resistance to even something as simple and logical as that. But yeah, I think it's a great question, and I wish I had an answer, and I wish that policymakers would realize, the other methods aren't working.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Nate Whitney had a question. Do you have any examples of countries that have been successful against these cartels?
Well, I guess one point I was trying to make is that you could say Colombia has been against the cartels, because you no longer hear about, remember, it used to be you would hear about Medellin and the Cali. You don't hear about them anymore. The difference is they've been replaced by other criminal syndicates that are more widely dispersed. And so on one hand, you can win one battle, then you create an even difficult, more challenging battle down the road.
I guess part of the question, maybe I didn't read the whole question, is he mentions the Netherlands as maybe an example of a country that's lowered its drug importation.
No, actually it's the opposite. So the Netherlands has actually become in Europe the major so Spain is one of the major transshipment points, probably because of cultural and historic relations with Latin America. So it used to be a lot of drugs went in through Spain. Also, Spain has a very rugged coast. The northwest part of Spain, Galicia, has long been famous for smuggling, going back centuries. So a lot of drugs go in through Spain, but through Spain, then they go to other parts of Europe. But from what I've read about the drug trade in Europe, is that the Netherlands has become the #1 place because Rotterdam is, I think, the busiest single port in all of Europe. And with container shipping, bringing stuff in through Rotterdam is a lot easier than using your submarines to go along to the coast of Spain. So Rotterdam has really become the center of that. Rotterdam and to a lesser extent Amsterdam.
Okay, so I'm just kind of maybe expand on that a little bit. Other than the United States, what are the other big markets for drugs? Europe?
Yeah, there's a lot of well, I would say the other markets for drugs are other wealthy nations like Europe. I mean, drugs cost money. And so Europe is a big one. One of the things we know is like for cocaine, so cocaine production based upon everything I've read reached an all-time high last year in Colombia. And still to this day, for reasons which I never understood, Latin America has a monopoly on the production of cocaine. I've always wondered, okay, why aren't they, can't you grow the coca plants in Africa or Asia or places like that? But they don't. It's all manufactured in Colombia. The actual manufacturing takes place in Colombia. And they keep finding new markets. So the United States, we know that cocaine use has actually gone down over the last 10 years. The United States is still the #1 market, but it's gone down relatively, and Europe is almost equal. The other thing that's changed is, Australia has become a big market. On a per capita basis, the Aussies use more coke than anybody. And the other thing that's really this is the thing that's really changed, is that increasingly they're discovering markets in Latin America itself. It used to be that all these dangerous drugs were produced in Latin America and exported away. And that's why in a place like Colombia, people are like, why are we having to suffer the consequences of the drug war when it's American consumers that are making this all possible? Well, now things have changed, because one of the things that changed is when Europe became a destination, a lot of the Colombian traffickers started moving the drug through Brazil. So Brazil became the major transshipment point. And through Brazil, it often went to West Africa or to Spain and then into the rest of Europe. But what's happened over time is that as it's passing through Brazil, traffickers there are like, why don't we create a market here in Brazil itself? And so today, Brazil is estimated to be the #2 market in the world after the United States. Rio de Janeiro has been riveted by spectacular levels of violence over the last decade as cocaine has become a major drug. There in the slums of Rio, it's largely smoked like crack was in the United States. So they break it down into crack, so it's super cheap, widely available. And of course, in Brazil, you're not selling cocaine for what you would in the United States. You can't, but you can still make a huge profit off it, even if you're selling it for a lot less. So Brazil has become a major country that's both consuming cocaine and in many ways, kind of, you guys probably recall what happened when the crack cocaine epidemic blew up in the United States in the mid-90s, and suddenly, here was this cheap form of cocaine that anybody can get access to. It's, $5 or $10 a hit, and boom, in many urban areas of the United States, there was a major escalation of violence as retail drug dealers on the streets fought for control of turf to sell the drug. I know, I don't live here in Indianapolis, but I know in the mid-90s, it was very bad here from what I hear. And it was in many other places, definitely was in Chicago. That's what they're experiencing now in Brazil.
Right.
So it's
yeah, Jennifer Peislich had a kind of an addition to that about Spain and Morocco shipping hash up through across the straits.
Yeah.
So I had a question about the government agencies working with these dictators in these countries. Manuel Noriega and so forth. I mean, there was a long time when the U.S. government agencies were looking the other way when these guys were supporting this. Or drug trafficking. Is that still going on? Or?
Particularly the drug trafficking really got caught up in the Cold War politics in the era. And it's interesting. There's a lot of interesting stories I can tell you related to that. Of course, Manuel Noriega was a famous one. When we basically sent in first our special forces and then our entire military to arrest a guy on drug charges. The guy who had been on the CIA payroll for years. He went the wrong way, and we found a means of going after him. But back at that time, you guys probably remember there was a revolution in Nicaragua, and the Sandinista government came into power. And then the U.S. tried to support a counter-revolution, the Contras. At the time, one of the things the United States tried to do to convince the public that the Sandinistas were a dangerous government was they kept making these spurious charges that the Sandinistas were involved in drug trafficking. Because around the 1980s is when you also start to see the movement of cocaine through Central America up through into the United States. So there would be these charges, the Reagan administration would put out that, the Sandinistas are involved in the cocaine trade. But we later found out actually the Contras were, and their American mercenary suppliers were very heavily involved. They were basically ship flying, they had these kind of CIA-owned airlines that would fly out of South Florida to ship weapons into Honduras, and they'd fly back with cocaine into South Florida, which was easy to do because nobody expected those planes when they came back. So today we know that the Contras were heavily involved in that. And of course, Manuel Noriega, of course, Panama's long been a transshipment point for everything from cocaine moving north to today, a lot of the drug money moving south. Panama is the ideal place for money laundering because they have bank secrecy laws like they do in Switzerland. So Panama City in particular has boomed as a result of everything that we were talking about, because it is a major center for the laundering of drug money. And that's a whole big industry in its own right. Because how do you take hundreds of millions of dollars of $10 and $20 bills, which is literally what you begin with, move them into Latin America, transform that into legal currency that then can be invested in other industries or sectors. So it's a real challenge. But if you ever go online and look up Panama City and look at the glistening massive skyline of Panama City today, it looks like Miami. And I can guarantee you a lot of that is money that's being laundered, and its origins were in drug money. But in terms of here's an interesting thing that's probably worth mentioning. For a long time, before the war on drugs began, one of the major transshipment points for illicit drugs into the United States was Cuba. Back in the 1920s, when Americans would go to Cuba to drink and to gamble, they'd also go there and you could get cocaine and you could get heroin. That became even more the case by the 1950s, when criminal organizations known in the United States as the mafia had a heavy presence, controlling casinos, controlling hotels, controlling the tourism industry in Havana. And Havana was full of drugs back then, and it was a major transshipment point. Well, one of the few things that the Cuban revolutionary government did that the United States would have agreed with, boom, they cut down on drug trafficking. And there's one area of cooperation between the United States and Cuba you never hear about, and that is drug interdiction. You know, Cuba does not, there is not a drug problem in Cuba. And Cuban government goes out of its way to make sure that that big island, because Cuba would be the ideal place to transship drugs into the United States from Colombia. And it never happened. Well, it's happened. There's been instances of Cuban officials being involved in drug trafficking. The most famous case happened in, I think it was the early 90s, when the Cuban government found out that one of its highest ranking generals actually was involved in drug trafficking. And he was a real war hero. He had led Cuban forces when they fought in Angola during the wars there in the 70s. So real war hero in Cuba. They found out he was working with the Colombian gangs, allowing them to transship drugs through Cuba. I think his name was General Rodriguez. And when Castro found out about that, they put him on trial. They found him guilty, and they executed him. So it's one of those rare cases where, you know, two countries known as real enemies can agree on one thing, that we're going to work together on drug interdiction.
So there's a question here, another question about the Mexican military. You know, you kind of mentioned that the pressure tactics that the gangs use on military and government officials, is there any hope for that, or is what's?
At times there's hope. I mean, as you probably know, there's a long history of very high-ranking Mexican military officials, including, you know, Mexico now also has a drug czar position, and several of them have fallen under accusations of taking millions of dollars in bribes. It's happened over and over again. And oftentimes these are people who the United States government has trained and worked closely with. The DEA trusts them. The DEA can't do anything in Mexico without working through the Mexican authorities. Mexicans take their national sovereignty very, very seriously. They're very prideful. They don't let the DEA or other US agencies just operate on their own. So the DEA has to work with these Mexican authorities, whether it's in military, Mexico's equivalent of the FBI, whatever. They have to depend on them, and sometimes it turns out those people are on the buy. I mean, it's hard to say. When you have cartels that are willing to give you, you know, literally millions of dollars to turn your head the other way, so you can fly a 747 full of cocaine from Colombia into Mexico, and that's pretty well documented. That's the level of smuggling we're talking about. You know, it happens. There was, and it's ongoing. There was just a case last year, or, you know, when the new Mexican president came into power, in which a former drug czar, who the DEA had found out was working with the cartels, flew into Los Angeles, and US authorities arrested him. But they had not told the Mexicans about it at all. And they had a lot of evidence that this guy had been on the take for a long time. Very, very high-ranking general in the Mexican military. And the United States arrested him. We're gonna, you know, basically we're gonna put him on trial. And the Mexican government really, really pushed back hard because they had done it unilaterally.
Yeah.
There had been no indication. Of course, the concern was, well, if we let you know, you're going to tip him off and he'll disappear. That's happened plenty of times. But in the end of the day, United States kind of backed down, and they released that guy, and he's living free in Mexico. Yeah. So it's a challenge, you know. It's a real challenge, and it's a hard one to overcome.
Okay. One more question then. What is the impact of all of this on the migration of Central Americans to the United States? And, you know, is this these gangs? You know, you hear that the unlivable conditions in some of these countries and forcing migration and immigration.
Yeah. That whole story of Central American migration through Mexico to the United States is, you know, on the level, a lot of the gang activity in places like El Salvador and Honduras isn't so much. Yeah, there's some, those gangs down there aren't, we're not talking about Mexican cartels. The Mexican cartels operate in Central America because they use it as a transshipment point. So they're not worried about, they're not the ones that are inspiring the violence on the streets in places like Honduras and El Salvador. Those gangs are, you know, these gangs you hear about, you know, MS-13, etc. These are kind of what the United States would call street gangs. They extort people, they kidnap people, they sell drugs at a low level. but they're very violent and they intimidate people. And that leads a lot of people to want to escape from El Salvador or Honduras, or to encourage their young daughters or sons to leave because they're going to be caught up in these gangs. The real challenge then becomes transit through Mexico, because these new criminal syndicates, as everything's splintered in Mexico, and you have all these new different criminal organizations have emerged, they came to realize there's a lot of money to be made doing things other than smuggling drugs into the United States. And one of their biggest targets is Central American migrants. And Central American migrants know it is extraordinarily costly and potentially risky and fatal, and even more so if you're a woman, to make your way through Mexico these days. Because one of the things we now know is that one of the primary means by which these new gangs recruit members is that they kidnap young Central American men and take them out to clandestine training camps and basically say, you're going to take this weapon and you're going to work for us, or this guy here who we're going to train, he's going to kill you. So a lot of these new Central Americans are being recruited. Some of them resist. And if they're not being recruited to work in the gangs, they're also being extorted. So a very common crime now is to kidnap them, tell them to call their families in the United States and say, you have X amount of time to give money or you're dead. And increasingly what's happening, well, it's not increasingly, it's been happening for over a decade now. When they resist, they basically take them out in large groups and they basically kill them all. So today we're finding mass graves in Mexico, sometimes dozens of people, bodies of Central American migrants. And it has a lot to do, again, it's one of those things where you can have success against the real genuine cartels. You go after the Sinaloa cartel, you break it apart, everything splinters. Now, former members of your cartel, they're going to fight for turf, or they're going to get into these new enterprises. And, back in the 1990s, they never would have thought about being involved in kidnapping Central American migrants. There was too much money to be made shipping drugs into the United States. But now everything has fragmented. And like that last map I showed you, this hodgepodge of different gangs that control different regions of Mexico, or will fight for control of, gas pipelines in Guanajuato. Well, Central American migrants are one of their targets.
So is there anything we can do about that, or is that a?
Well,
Yeah.
we can send Kamala Harris down there and tell them to,
Yeah, right.
to get their ship in order, or Well, one thing we could probably do is take more seriously when people arrive at a U.S. border and say they're applying for political asylum, and going back to El Salvador, Honduras will be a death sentence, and it is for some of them. But right now, that's not happening.
All right, I think that kind of wraps up our questions here. Betty, do you want to take us home, please?
Well, this was sobering, Michael. Thank you very much.
I wish I could have delivered a more optimistic assessment of the war on drugs.
Yeah, no, it was very sobering. I want to thank you. That was very, very interesting. You made this very compelling for us.
Thank you.
Take a closer look. I'm personally very disappointed to hear about Guanajuato, because there was something that appeared on Facebook. You may have seen it when people started talking about, oh, Mexico is nothing but drugs, you don't want to go there. And I just remember years ago in a Rotary, one of the Rotarians, he was from Mexico, and his father said, oh, he wanted his father to come and visit. Because of all of our shootings and gun violence we have here in the United States, he said, no way, you're just way too violent. No, son, you should come home and get a job here. And it's really too bad, because I'm one who wants to advocate for all the other aspects of Mexico that are rich in culture and history and all kinds of things. And it's very sobering. Join us, please, next week. Mexico is our neighbor, of course, to the south. And next week, with distinguished speakers, we are going to dive into our neighbor to the north, Canada. And the title of the program is Canada and the U.S., so close and yet so different. And we want you to join us to really see what that difference is. And the program is going to be presented to you, Michael. You'll know these cast of characters. You'll know one of them, Dr. Pierre Atlas and Dr. Kenneth Holland. And they're also, like Michael, very close to us here at ICWA. And they both have spent a lot of time in Canada enough to, if there is dual citizenship, they would probably have it. And they're going to present to us, I think, a very intriguing program. We think we know about our neighbors, and yet there's so much we have to learn. And so please come back and join us next week. I think you'll enjoy it from a very good perspective. And then return back to us here with Great Decisions on February the 22nd. We're going to have Dr. Sergei Zuk, who is going to talk about Russia's disinformation campaign. And considering what's going on in the world with Ukraine and the world literally on edge, as only Putin, as we're told over and over, knows what Putin's going to do. Who knows over the next 2 weeks what he might do. Let's hope he leaves Ukraine alone. But please come back and join us next week, the week after. We just promise you the best programs we can deliver, and we hope you're enjoying it. And remember, we need your help. We really need your help. We want your help. We are growing. We're doing some strategic planning that has the same mission, but a great vision. But we can only do it with your support. So we love having you with us. Just consider, please becoming a member. It's very nominal. Please consider also a donation and just walk with us. We want to have you to join with us. Good evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Night.
Good night.